What happens when a Hollywood icon walks into what should be a friendly morning show and things go completely off the rails? Today we're breaking down the moment Demi Moore erupted on Today with Jenna and friends. And trust me, this is not what anyone expected. The tension was real, the clash was intense, and by the end you'll see exactly why this interview is making waves everywhere. Before we get into it, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling me whose side you're on after watching this, because this one's going to divide people. Jenna Bush Hager opens the segment with her signature warm smile, welcoming Demi Moore to the couch alongside co-hosts Hoda Kotb and guest host Scarlett Johansson. The energy starts light, almost too light. Jenna leads with what seems like an innocent question about Demi's latest project, a drama series where she plays a former prosecutor facing her own moral reckoning. Demi answers graciously at first, discussing the complexity of the character and how she connected with the role on a personal level. The conversation flows smoothly, touching on themes of redemption and accountability. Then Jenna shifts gears. She brings up Demi's memoir, specifically the sections where Demi discussed her past relationships and the public scrutiny she faced during some of her most difficult periods. The question itself isn't aggressive, but there's an undertone that Demi clearly picks up on. Jenna asks if Demi feels she's been transparent enough about certain choices she made during those years, particularly regarding her family dynamics and the men she was involved with. Demi's expression changes subtly. Her smile remains, but it's tighter now, more controlled. She responds carefully, saying she shared what she felt was necessary to share, and that her memoir was about her truth, not about satisfying everyone's curiosity. Scarlett tries to lighten the mood, jumping in with a comment about how brave it is to be so open in a book, how vulnerability takes real courage. Demi thanks her, and for a moment it seems like the conversation might pivot back to safer ground. But Jenna isn't done. She follows up by referencing a specific passage in the book where Demi wrote about feeling like she had to shrink herself to fit into Hollywood's expectations, and then Jenna asks, with what could be interpreted as genuine curiosity or thinly veiled critique, whether Demi thinks she sometimes played into those expectations rather than fighting against them. There's a pause. A long one. Demi looks directly at Jenna, and you can feel the temperature in the room drop. She asks Jenna to clarify what she means by that. Jenna, seemingly not realizing she's on thin ice, elaborates. She mentions how Demi's choices in certain films, her relationships with younger men, and even some of her public statements over the years could be seen as conforming to the very standards she now criticizes. Jenna frames it as a question about evolution and growth, but the implication is clear. Was Demi complicit in the system she now condemns? Demi doesn't raise her voice, not yet, but her tone becomes sharper. She says she finds it interesting that Jenna would frame it that way, especially considering the industry's tendency to hold women accountable for navigating a landscape that was designed to exploit them. She points out that questioning whether she fought hard enough or made the right choices ignores the reality of what it was like to be a woman in Hollywood during her rise to fame. The rules were different, the power dynamics were different, and survival often meant making compromises that people sitting in judgment decades later couldn't possibly understand. Hoda tries to step in, attempting to steer the conversation towards something more positive. She brings up Demi's advocacy work and her efforts to support women in the industry now. Demi acknowledges this with a nod, but her focus remains on Jenna. There's an unspoken tension between them now, and it's impossible to ignore. Jenna, perhaps feeling defensive or maybe just trying to justify her line of questioning, doubles down. She says she's not judging. She's simply trying to have an honest conversation about the contradictions that exist in everyone's life, including Demi's. Demi leans forward slightly. She asks Jenna if she's ever been in a position where every choice she made was scrutinized, dissected, and used against her. She asks if Jenna has ever had to choose between her career and her dignity, between speaking out and being blacklisted. Jenna stumbles, saying that she's faced challenges too, that being in the public eye comes with its own pressures. Demi cuts her off, not rudely but firmly. She says this isn't about who's had it harder, it's about understanding context before making judgments. Scarlett looks uncomfortable now, glancing between Demi and Jenna as if trying to figure out how to diffuse the situation. Hoda is doing the same, her smile frozen in place. The audience, which had been laughing and clapping earlier, is silent. Jenna, to her credit or perhaps her detriment, doesn't back down. She says she respects Demi's perspective, but insists that part of growth is being able to look back critically at our own actions. She mentions how other public figures have done this, naming a couple of celebrities who've publicly reckoned with their past behavior. Demi's eyes narrow. She asks Jenna if she's comparing her to those individuals, and if so, what specifically she thinks Demi needs to reckon with. Jenna hesitates, realizing she may have pushed too far, but she's committed now. She brings up an interview Demi did years ago where she made a comment that some people interpreted as dismissive toward other women in the industry. Demi immediately asks which interview, what comment, and what the full context was. Jenna admits she doesn't remember the exact details. She just remembers it being discussed online. And this is where things really escalate. Demi's voice remains calm, but there's a controlled intensity that's somehow more powerful than yelling. She says it's incredibly irresponsible for Jenna to bring up something she can't even cite properly. To accuse her of saying something dismissive without knowing the context or even the exact words. She points out that this is exactly the problem. People take fragments of truth, strip them of context, and weaponize them. She says if Jenna wanted to have a real conversation about accountability, she should have come prepared with facts, not vague recollections of internet gossip. Jenna's face flushes. She tries to apologize, saying she didn't mean to misrepresent anything, but Demi isn't accepting the apology. Not yet. She says this is bigger than just this moment. It's about the way women are constantly expected to explain themselves, to justify their past, to perform contrition for choices they made under circumstances that no one else had to endure. She says she wrote her memoir to reclaim her narrative, not to have it picked apart by someone who wasn't there, who didn't live it, and who clearly didn't do the homework. Hoda finally manages to interject more forcefully, suggesting they take a breath and maybe move on to another topic. But Demi turns to her and says, with all due respect, she doesn't think they should move on. She thinks this is exactly the conversation that needs to happen, right here, right now. She says too often these moments get smoothed over. Everyone pretends everything is fine, and nothing changes. She wants to address this head-on. Jenna looks genuinely shaken now. She says she didn't intend for the conversation to go this way, that she was trying to facilitate a meaningful discussion. Demi responds by saying that intent doesn't erase impact. She tells Jenna that coming onto a show and being asked to defend choices she made 30 years ago without proper context or research doesn't feel like a meaningful discussion. It feels like a setup. The word setup lands hard, and you can see Jenna recoil slightly. Scarlett finally speaks up, her voice careful and measured. She says she understands both perspectives, that sometimes in live television things can come out differently than intended. Demi turns to her and says she appreciates that, but this wasn't a slip of the tongue. This was a prepared segment with prepared questions, and the choice to go down this road was deliberate. She asks Scarlett directly if she's ever been asked questions like this, where the premise is, essentially, explain why you weren't perfect in an imperfect system. Scarlett admits that she has, and that it's frustrating. Demi nods and says exactly, so why are we still doing this to each other? She looks back at Jenna and asks why, on a show that's supposed to celebrate women, she felt it was appropriate to put another woman on trial for surviving an industry that chewed people up and spit them out. Jenna starts to say something about asking tough questions being part of journalism, but Demi cuts her off. She says this isn't journalism, it's morning television, and there's a difference between tough questions and gotcha questions. Hoda tries once more to redirect, mentioning that they're running short on time and asking if Demi can talk about her upcoming projects. Demi takes a breath and says sure, she can talk about her projects, but she wants to make one thing clear first. She says she's not angry at Jenna personally. She's angry at a culture that enables this kind of questioning. She's angry that even now, after everything that's happened in the industry, after all the conversations about how women are treated, we're still playing these same games. Jenna looks like she wants to respond but doesn't know what to say. There's a moment where it seems like she might actually engage with what Demi is saying on a deeper level. Instead, she offers another apology, this one sounding more sincere. She says she hears what Demi is saying and she'll reflect on it. Demi nods slowly, as if deciding whether to accept this or push further. Then Demi does something unexpected. She tells Jenna that she actually wants to answer the original question properly, the one about whether she played into Hollywood's expectations. She says yes, absolutely she did, because that was the cost of admission. She explains that when you're a young woman trying to build a career in an industry run almost entirely by men, you don't have the luxury of being revolutionary at every turn. You pick your battles, you make strategic choices, and sometimes you do things you're not proud of because the alternative is being shut out completely. She talks about how she took roles that objectified her because those were the roles being offered, and turning them all down would have meant no career at all. She discusses relationships that people judged her for, saying that everyone acts like they would have made better choices. But they weren't living her life, dealing with her circumstances, facing her specific set of options. She says the real question isn't why she made the choices she made. It's why those were the only choices available to her in the first place. Jenna is listening now, really listening, and you can see something shifting in her expression. She asks more gently this time if Demi feels like things have changed enough for the next generation. Demi pauses before answering. She says some things have changed, but not as much as people like to think. She points out that women are still asked to be palatable, still expected to shrink themselves, still judged more harshly for the same behavior that men are celebrated for. The difference is that now there's more awareness, more conversation, but awareness doesn't automatically translate to change. Scarlett adds that she's felt this too, how there's pressure to be the cool girl, the one who doesn't make waves, who can take a joke, who doesn't complain. Demi agrees and says that's exactly it. She says women are trapped in this impossible position where if you speak up, you're difficult, but if you stay silent, you're complicit. And then years later, someone like Jenna will ask you why you didn't do more, why you didn't fight harder, without acknowledging that fighting meant risking everything. Hoda, seeming to genuinely engage with the conversation now rather than just trying to manage it, brings up her own experiences of being told to smile more, to be warmer, to not be too opinionated. Demi nods and says this is what she's talking about. These aren't isolated incidents. They're systemic patterns that affect all women differently based on their position, their power, their options. She says her memoir was an attempt to show the reality of navigating that system, not to present herself as a victim or a hero, just as a human being doing her best. Jenna asks if Demi thinks the memoir achieved that goal. Demi says she thinks it did for people who were willing to read it with empathy and context. But for people who came to it looking for ammunition, for contradictions to point out, for reasons to tear her down, no amount of honesty would have been enough. She says that's the exhausting part, knowing that no matter how vulnerable you are, no matter how much you share, some people will always find a way to use it against you. The conversation has shifted now. It's no longer a clash, it's become something more substantive. Jenna asks what Demi wishes people understood about her journey. Demi thinks for a moment and then says she wishes people understood that you can critique the system while having participated in it. She wishes they understood that survival and complicity aren't the same thing. She wishes they understood that holding women accountable for not dismantling a patriarchal system while they were just trying to survive in it is fundamentally unfair. She continues, saying she's done apologizing for not being perfect, for not having all the answers, for making choices that made sense at the time even if they don't look great in hindsight. She says she's proud of the work she's done, the roles she's taken, the risks she's made, and yes, even some of the mistakes, because they taught her things. She says her life doesn't need to be a morality tale where everything ties up neatly. It's messy and complicated, just like everyone else's. Jenna takes a deep breath and says something that feels genuine. She thanks Demi for not letting her off the hook, for pushing back, for demanding better. She admits that she came into this interview with questions that, in retrospect, were framed unfairly. She says she's learned something from this exchange, And while it was uncomfortable, it was necessary. Demi looks at her for a long moment, then says she appreciates that acknowledgement. Hoda seizes this moment of connection and asks Demi what advice she would give to young women entering the industry now. Demi doesn't hesitate. She says know your worth, document everything, and find your community. She explains that isolation is how the system maintains power, making you think you're the only one experiencing what you're experiencing, that your struggles are unique or somehow your fault. She says when women talk to each other, support each other, believe each other, that's when real change becomes possible. Scarlett adds that she's seen this shift happening. More women in positions of power, more solidarity, more willingness to call things out. Demi agrees but cautions against complacency. She says every generation thinks they've solved the problem, that things are better now, and while incremental progress is real, it's fragile. She says it requires constant vigilance, constant pushing, constant refusal to accept the unacceptable. She says that's why moments like this, uncomfortable as they are, matter. Because if we can't have honest conversations with each other, how can we expect to change anything? Jenna asks Demi if she feels like this conversation, as difficult as it was, achieved something. Demi considers this carefully. She says she thinks it did, not because they reached some perfect resolution, but because they didn't pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. She says authenticity is messy, real dialogue involves conflict, and growth requires discomfort. She says she'd rather have a heated exchange that leads to understanding than a polite conversation that changes nothing. The energy in the studio has completely transformed. What started as a confrontation has become something more meaningful. Hoda comments on this, saying that this is exactly the kind of real conversation that people need to see. Demi responds that she hopes so, because she's tired of the performance of feminism that doesn't actually challenge anything. She's tired of surface-level solidarity that falls apart the moment things get uncomfortable. She says real support means being willing to hear hard truths, to sit with discomfort, to admit when you're wrong. Scarlett brings up the fact that this interview will definitely get people talking. Demi laughs, a genuine laugh this time, and says that's an understatement. She says she knows she'll be called difficult, angry, too sensitive, all the usual labels that get thrown at women who refuse to play nice. But she says she's made peace with that. She'd rather be respected than liked, and if being honest means some people don't like her, that's a trade she's willing to make. Jenna then does something that feels significant. She looks directly at the camera and says to the audience that what they just witnessed was uncomfortable for everyone involved, including her. She says it would have been easier to smooth things over, to move on quickly, to pretend the tension wasn't there. But Demi didn't let that happen. And Jenna says she's grateful for it, even though it was hard. She says she hopes viewers will sit with this conversation, think about their own assumptions, and consider how they might be perpetuating the same patterns they claim to oppose. Demi thanks Jenna for that, saying it takes courage to be that honest on live television. She says accountability isn't about shame, it's about learning and doing better. She says she's not interested in canceling anyone or making enemies. She's interested in progress, and progress requires all of us to be willing to look at our own behavior, our own biases, our own complicity. She says that includes her too, that she's still learning, still growing, still figuring things out. The interview winds down with Hoda asking one final question about what's next for Demi. Demi talks briefly about her upcoming projects, but more than that, she talks about her commitment to using her platform to advocate for change. She says she's not interested in being a cautionary tale or an inspiration. She's just interested in being honest. She says if her story helps someone else feel less alone, if it makes someone think differently about the choices women make under pressure, then it's worth it. As the segment ends, there's a palpable sense that something real just happened. The audience applauds, but it's different from the usual morning show applause. It's more thoughtful, more uncertain. The kind of response you get when people aren't quite sure what they just witnessed, but they know it mattered. Jenna thanks Demi for her time and her honesty. Demi thanks the whole panel, and there's a moment of genuine connection between all of them, an acknowledgement that they just navigated something difficult together. So there you have it, The moment Demi Moore erupted on Today with Jenna and Friends. This wasn't about drama for drama's sake. This was about a woman refusing to be diminished, refusing to play by rules that were designed to keep her small, refusing to accept questions that were framed unfairly. Whether you think Demi was right to push back as hard as she did, or whether you think Jenna was just doing her job, one thing is clear: this conversation needed to happen. Make sure you subscribe for more breakdowns like this, and drop a comment below. Do you think morning shows should ask tougher questions even if it creates conflict? Or should they stick to keeping things light and friendly? I want to hear your thoughts.